flood zones, we hear that term everywhere in Houston. Now, what does that actually mean? Being in a flood zone doesn't necessarily mean that you're gonna flood, right? It means that you're in an area that might have flooded years ago, or just based on FEMA map and just historical data, you're in a maybe low hazardous or high hazardous flood zone area. For example, we know in the Meyerland area, which is known for flooding in Houston, majority of those houses are in flood zone AEs or flood zone A's, which are high risk areas. And there's some areas around Houston that are low risk areas that are probably in the flood zone X that are not shaded. In those flood zone X, you don't necessarily have to raise the house. You might see rain, water, come up, but never flood your house. Usually in flood zone X, those houses are in a 500-year floodplain. The 500-year floodplain is not that you're gonna flood once every 500 years. No. It's just the chances of you flooding are probably 0.03% compared to a flood zone A or a flood zone AE where you'd be at a higher risk. You'd be at a 1% chance of flooding every year. That doesn't mean you're gonna flood once every 100 years either. Just the higher the risk of flooding could happen, every single year, especially during hurricane season. People are buying a house or looking to buy. They always overlook this important aspect, where the house is located or the property is located, and if it's in a flood zone. Necessarily, being in this industry, being in a flood zone X, if I were to buy a house right now in that area, wouldn't scare me or draw me away. It might just push me to be more cautious and just, make a proper buying decision, but not enough for me to go away and not look into that property. So if you're in a flood zone X or looking to buy in a flood zone X, yeah, you're fine. You shouldn't be worried. What about a flood zone A or a flood zone AE? Those high risk flood zone areas, they might not flood, right? They might not flood in the next 1 to 2, 3, 4 years. We had a very big event that happened in 2017, right? The Hurricane Harvey, and it did cause a lot of damage, which, we understand that people are still suffering from these issues till today. Being aware of the flood zone that you're in is important, especially when you gotta go through the insurance process. If you're in a flood zone X, chances are, like I mentioned earlier in the video, that you probably don't need to get flood insurance. It's recommended in some areas, but you don't need it. But in a higher risk area, you'll need it, absolutely, for sure. And you're sometimes forced to have it. It does benefit you and it does help you because, with uncontrollable weather, we never know when another flood like Hurricane Harvey could happen again. So being prepared and being knowledgeable in these flood zones is very important. 100-year floodplain versus a 500-year floodplain. Usually when people hear these terms, they say, oh my goodness, my house is probably gonna flood in 500 years or 100 years, or they get the terms mixed up. A 500-year floodplain, basically your home might flood every year between a 0% chance, a 0.03% chance. 100-year floodplain, you have a 1% chance of flooding every year. Even then, out of 100, that is still really low chances. But obviously, they're not zero. So taking proper precaution, it's important for every homeowner. These two floodplains are important when buying a house. I mean, sometimes those floodplain numbers may scare you, but they're not really a detour away from you purchasing that property or living in that house still, right? Don't freak out if you go on FEMA flood map and see that your home is in a 100-year floodplain and you haven't flooded. That's great. That's really good news. But that's not enough for you to be like, no, let me sell it. Obviously, there's alternative measures to take care of your area. And sometimes also getting a land surveyor to come out and see the elevations of where your house is at, right? And seeing the BFE, the base flood elevation, compared to your house where it currently sits. It might just be at the BFE or above the BFE. So getting a land surveyor is always the best way to do it. Now, it does come, pretty costly depending on if you're gonna hire somebody to come and give you an elevation certificate. The elevation certificate is pretty much everything that a homeowner that lives in a flood zone has to showcase where their house is currently sitting at. So being in a high risk flood zone area, what should every homeowner do to prepare? Well, if you're in a flood zone AE or you don't know at all, the first thing you should do is figure that out. Right? You can get with a land surveyor. These guys are usually able to give you your elevation certificate, which tells you BFE, your base flood elevation, and the current elevation of your home. If you're under the BFE, let's say for example, your elevation on your house is 57 feet, but the BFE sits at 60 feet. If you're in a high risk flood zone, you cannot just be 57 to raise it to meet the 60 feet. It's 3 feet. You can't. You have to meet the requirements, and usually you have to be 1 to 2 foot above that BFE. So you'd have to raise the home from 57 feet. 60 would be 3 feet. Plus, to be compliant, you need to be 2 feet more above that. So you'd have to raise 5 feet. But obviously, there's ways to be very specific on this. That is mainly for areas where you bought a house recently, did flood during Hurricane Harvey, did flood flood, 2 years ago during Hurricane Beryl. So, taking proper steps, it's important if you're buying a house in a flood zone. Now, if you already live or you live currently in a flood zone and you have flooded in the past, it's kind of difficult to take proper steps to not flood again. The reason being that if you're in a high-risk flood zone, I'm gonna be real honest, usually people should have raised their house by this time. Given the area or given where you're currently living at, given that we have our own machine, equipment, our own lift operator and everything, we're able to help out customers who have flooded and who are high risk flood zone areas. But usually who we run into is homeowners that never flooded. They're aware that they need to raise, but they're probably in those percentages of they'll flood every couple years if a big flood does happen. So the first thing you should always do is figure out where you're currently at. You can do that by going to the FEMA website. If you go on the internet and search up what's my BFE, you'll see a bunch of FEMA websites where you can just put your address and it'll show up your pin location and see a flood map and shows you exactly where you're at. Don't get scared if you show up in a flood zone, right? Because if you haven't flooded, but you show up in a flood zone, chances are your home is probably at the BFE or above the BFE, which is really good. But if it shows under that, right? If you have a land surveyor come out and they show that you're under what is required to meet, then you might have to raise your house if that is something that you need. But for a flood zone X, usually people that live in a flood zone X that hasn't flooded at all, near floodways, near flood areas, but they're not close enough to get any damage to them. Usually these areas are not shaded, or they are shaded, and with a French drain or simple drainage systems, you'll be all right. Homeowner shouldn't really be worried. If you're gonna buy a house that's in this area specifically, that's not something that should, push you away from buying the house. It's in a low risk area for a reason. Obviously, taking proper steps since it's your first time buying a house, or if it's for a business or rental, making sure where you're currently at is really important, especially if you're gonna invest a large amount of money or pulling out a mortgage to buy a house. Being aware that you're financing and, you're investing in something that won't get destroyed by floodwaters eventually. So the information was brief, right? Just touching base on what a flood zone is, which ones are hazardous, and if you're in one, what to do first. Going forward after this, if you are interested in looking to see if you're in a flood zone, you can contact us and we can give you a brief idea. Obviously, you do need a land surveyor to give you an elevation certificate. And if you already have that, great. You can contact us. We can go out, send one of our company reps that specializes only in structural elevation. They'll be able to give you a bid on what you're looking for, especially if you're in a high-risk flood zone area. Realistically, when it comes to home elevation, we've seen the worst of the worst when it comes to people being in a flood zone. And, being in a high-risk flood area, there's no other recommendation other than going up with the house. In today's economy, we see a bunch of messages. People say, well, I can just buy a house with what you guys charge me for a home elevation. Well, not in 2026, realistically. With the price of everything and the economy, just being at an all-time high, sometimes at this point it is much cheaper to raise your structure than to destroy it or demo it or move out and get in debt with another mortgage. At the end of the day, we do offer financing, so if you are interested in that, you can always contact us, ask us about financing and how it works for big projects. And if you just need us to give you advice on what you can do for your house, don't hesitate to give us a call. We're more than happy to assist you and answer any questions that you may have regarding your home. And if you are just getting or trying to get a brief idea of where you're currently at and you don't understand how the flood maps work, give us a call. We'll be more than happy to give you a quick idea of where your house is currently at, how high you may need to raise, or if you need to raise at all. And we can also give you exact area where your home is at. So if you're in a flood zone X, AE, we'll be able to tell you that. So if it's from getting a quote from us or just want advice or a quick consultation on what you should do, give us a call. We'll be more than happy to help you. If you just need or have questions that need to be answered, we'll be more than happy to assist you there as well. You can always give us a call to our office at 832-398-6280, or you can visit our website at www.leonfoundationrepair.com, and we have a very informative house raising section that also goes in depth into what we were just talking about on specifying exactly what flood zone you're in and what hazardous things could happen to you in that area.